Thank you. Thank you for that great introduction. Thank you, everybody. Thanks to the Freedom Center and Okay, what I want to do here tonight is talk a little bit about some of my reasons for writing Surviving America's Depression Epidemic. Talk about some of the causes of depression, a little bit different than what you're hearing on these drug commercials on television. I guarantee you that. And talk about some of the reasons why these rates of depression are rising dramatically in the U.S. But mostly what I care about, and which is what most of the book is about, is what the heck we can do about this depression. What can we do about it on an individual basis, how we can help ourselves, how we can help one another, but also what we can do to transform this increasingly depressing society. So what I want to do is just start with this depression epidemic, a little bit about that. About a decade ago in 1998, the then president of the American Psychological Association, a guy named Martin Seligman, so ironically Mr. Positive Psychology, he's asked to speak to the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. And what he reports to them is some pretty depressing stuff on depression. Based on several epidemiological surveys, what Seligman reports to them is that the rate of depression in the U.S. has increased tenfold, maybe even higher than that in the last 50 years. And since that talk, there's been other epidemiological surveys that show this increasing rate continues. He also reports to them that the average age for the first onset of depression has gone from about 30 years of age, about a generation ago, to nowadays somewhere between 14 and 15 years of age. That's average onset of depression. Okay? A little while later, the World Health Organization has some other interesting news, at least interesting for me, about depression. And what they say is that depression occurs more, it's more prevalent in high-income societies, wealthy societies, like the United States. So I had a lot of questions about all of this, and one place I think I want to start with is just what is the cause of depression? Now, if you've been living in the United States here for the last 20 years, especially since Prozac hit the market late 1987, early 1988, the first of these so-called SSRI drugs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor drugs, just a fancy way of saying that these drugs maintain the neurotransmitter serotonin within a neurosynapse a little longer. And Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft, Selectors, a whole string of these kind of SSRI type of drugs. Ever since those drugs hit the market, and then even more so starting about 1997 when they were allowing these drug commercials, they all started around then. The American public has been exposed to this idea that depression's mainly caused by this deficiency of serotonin, deficiency of some kind of neurotransmitter, and serotonin being the most famous one, and these Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft drugs, the rationale behind them was that they're going to fix this depression because they're going to restore this chemical brain imbalance. And previous to these kind of drugs, most psychiatric drugs had not done that spectacularly well because they had just been kind of marketed as just taking the edge off of people's pain to help them function. But these drugs, these Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft drugs, these were the first multi-billion-dollar blockbuster drugs. Zoloft is still in the $3 billion range. It's still on patent. Some of these other drugs like Prozac has off patent, but they've all at their peak hit at least $2 billion a year, which is just huge. I mean, back in before this whole blitz, the whole depression antidepressant market was only about $250 million a year, and mainly because of this rationale of thinking like, well, you're doing something sort of like taking insulin to correct diabetes, and this was a great idea in terms of getting people to feel good about taking psychotropic drugs. Okay, all of this though begged the question for me early on, which is if we know the rates of depression are going through the roof, and you're telling us that depression is primarily caused by this low level of serotonin, the obvious question is, well, what the heck is sucking the serotonin out of us? I mean, extraterrestrials come down from outer space and just sucked it out of us. I mean, what's happening here? What are all the studies showing on this? Okay? And so, where are the studies? What are they saying? Well, there are no studies. And let me tell you why. By the mid-1990s, the scientific community had already established there was no association between serotonin levels and depression. Okay? And it sounds a little controversial, so let me just document this for a couple of minutes. If you took a look, by 1998, the American Medical Association's Essential Guide to Depression says clearly there's no clear relationship at all between serotonin levels and depression. People have high serotonin levels, they get depressed, medium levels, low levels, there's no relationship. People still were not hearing about this, okay? Sort of like there's some similarities between sort of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and the supposed Al-Qaeda Saddam Hussein connection, which they knew from the get-go did not exist, okay? But it sold something, didn't it? A war. So by 2002, though, the mainstream press is starting to cover this. New York Times, even that year, runs a big article, a front-page article in their Sunday paper on antidepressants, depression, and it tucked about 50 paragraphs into this article. They talk about this neurotransmitter serotonin deficiency theory of depression. And they say, and this is an exact quote, a multitude of studies failed to prove this precept. Again, people still believe it because they've heard it so many times. So once again, it was a big surprise. Last year, Newsweek runs a cover story, some of you might remember, Men in Depression. And in that cover story, they talk to some of the leading people in psychiatry officialdom, their psychiatric establishment. They talk to the director of the National Institute of Mental Health, for example, a guy named Thomas Insel. And they ask him, what about this neurotransmitter serotonin deficiency theory of depression? And he said, oh no, we've moved past that. He says, depression is not caused by an underproduction of anything. And so actually psychiatry officialdom has now moved on to new theories having to do with excessive cortisol and neurological damage and a whole new string of other theories. And some people are saying, well, why are they finally talking about this a little bit more loudly? Well, there's a lot of cynical theories behind why they're announcing it a little more loudly, some of which having to do with the fact that these drugs are going off patent, these SSRI drugs, and they're preparing us all for new drugs with a new theory, new biochemical theory. Who knows the truth? It'd be a real good time to talk about a model of depression that maybe fit a little bit of the data, okay? And maybe actually even fit a little bit of common sense, all right? Which I'm embarrassed to say is increasingly sort of heresy, in mental health professionals. Mm-hmm. But I thought a good place to start with kind of trying to create a model that made a little bit more sense of depression is to talk about what we do know, in fact, is associated with depression. And I'm going to go through a brief list of areas that are associated with depression, and I will tell you, for those of you who have retained your common sense, first of all, congratulations. Second of all, if you've retained your common sense in the face of all this, pharmaceutical company marketing, it's not an easy thing to do. But you will not be surprised by the list that I go through. In fact, some of you will just yawn and say, you social scientists need studies to prove that stuff? That's obvious. But let me go through the list. One thing we've known for many years, many studies showing that depression is highly associated with social isolation, with loneliness, with a lack of social support. Now, a real scientist asked the question, well, does loneliness cause depression? Or when people are depressed, do they stop keeping their relationships? Do they stop meeting people? And that's a good question. And a lot of when you want to think about depression is that a lot of these things, they go both ways. There are these vicious cycles, these kind of interactions. Another area that's highly associated with depression, and it also has to do with relationships. And relationships are really important when you're thinking about depression. And so the second area that's really important is significant miserable relationships. Okay, highly associated with depression. So for example, a miserable marriage. We have one major study, for example, that shows when unhappily married depressed women were asked. By the way, unhappily married depressed women are not a difficult population to find in America. When they were asked, what they thought was the cause of their depression, the majority of these unhappily married depressed women said their unhappy marriage. Now, again, if you were to ask their spouses, probably some of their spouses would say, yeah, well, our unhappy marriage might have made her depressed, but her depression didn't do wonders for our marriage. And so again, there are these vicious cycles. What else? Poverty. Poverty is highly associated with depression, at least in the United States. If you're living in a society where everybody around you is poor, or economically impoverished anyways, it's not as painful, it's not as associated with depression. But in the U.S., if you're on welfare, you're on public assistance, your rate of depression is 3 times as high, maybe even higher, than the general population. And in a similar vein, if you're unemployed, your rate of depression is almost twice as high as the general population. What else? Trauma, abuse, neglect, highly associated with depression. Okay, we actually have over 200 studies that show if you've experienced childhood trauma, the likelihood that you're going to be depressed is in some of these studies 12 times as high as the general population. What else? Any kind of major physical incapacitation, any kind of major business loss, any kind of economic loss, any kind of interpersonal loss, all of these things are much more likely for you to move into these symptoms of depression. So it seemed to me one thing to do is to ask yourself, what's the common thread between social isolation, miserable, significant relationships, poverty, unemployment, trauma, all these things? What's the thread? Well, it's pain. It's overwhelming emotional pain. And so for me, a common sense way to look at depression is really that it is a strategy to shut down overwhelming pain. And that all of us human beings have strategies when we feel overwhelmed by pain. Some of us move into excessive alcohol abuse, and we watch television all day long. I mean, there's just almost an infinite amount of things that we human beings do, from shopping all day long to eating all day long. There's just tons of things we do, legal drugs, illegal drugs. And if we do these things once in a while, on occasion, it's not going to maybe do us some great harm. But all of these strategies to shut down overwhelming pain, we can kind of get accustomed to, almost get addicted to. And a lot of people ask me, well, I don't understand what you mean. I never heard of depression being referred to as a strategy to shut down pain. I don't know what the heck you're talking about. And I ask people to say, like, what happens, with all of these strategies is that people fantasize that they can selectively shut down their pain. But you can't selectively shut down your pain, so you have a general shutdown. And think about what the symptoms of depression are. Classic symptoms in the DSM symptoms, the classic symptoms are a shutdown of energy level, a shutdown of any ability to experience any kind of pleasure. Certainly a shutdown of sex drive is a classic symptom. Shutdown of cognitive functioning, memory, attention, concentration, sometimes a shutdown of appetite, all these shutdown symptoms. Along with that, you have these self-loathing symptoms that go with it, guilt, self-reproach, sometimes even suicidal thoughts. And so what happens, from my point of view, in a highly industrialized society with no safety nets for many people like the U.S., this is incredibly terrifying, this shutdown, because people know at some level, wow, if I continue to shut down, I move to a state of immobilization, which is the jargon term in my business is called major depression, okay? Complete shutdown. And in this kind of culture, you shut down, and to that point, for very long, people are terrified that they don't have enough energy to get out of their bed to go to work. They'll lose their job, certainly won't have any energy to find another job, and everybody's nightmare, ending up on the streets, homeless, institutionalized. This is terrifying for a lot of people walking around. But what happens? Does that fear motivate people to pull themselves up by their bootstraps? Well, often not, because what is fear but pain? There's nothing more painful than fear. And so what do people do? They move into their shutdown strategy, sometimes depression, substance abuse, whatever, and you see we have a vicious cycle. And that's what depression, that's one way of looking at it. And a major reason why I wrote this book was to help people figure out a way to get out of this vicious cycle. And that's what I want to get back to in a little bit. But before I get to that whole topic, about the topic of just what is causing these huge increasing rates of depression in the U.S.? What is it all about? And we could probably be here all night on this topic, I think. That's my experience. Everybody has their ideas on this. But I want to go through a few, I think, key areas here. One area that is increasingly becoming politically correct to talk about, which makes me kind of grin, because a decade ago, when I was writing about this kind of stuff, I could only get articles published in like Z Magazine or Adbusters or places like this on this, because it was politically incorrect to talk about how pharmaceutical companies and psychiatry were diseasing, pathologizing, medicalizing normal human reactions. But now it's becoming, more and more mainstream. You see, there's a slew of books like now by Loss of Sadness and Medicalization of Society, and there's lots of stuff even written in mainstream corporate press about it. In many ways, because psychiatry's gone so far. They've gone so far, and that's even the New York Times starts to write about when they find out about like normal teenage rebellion, they're calling oppositional defiant disorder. And they're calling normal shyness, social anxiety disorder. And in many cases, they're calling normal grief, normal sadness, depression. And there's, in fact, many studies out there backing this up where they show that many people go to their doctor's office and the doctor doesn't ask them anything about their life at all, gives them one of these depression questionnaires which take them about 5-10 minutes to fill out. They click off enough symptoms, and later on some researcher asks this person, well, what is going on in your life? And they find out, well, this person, they've just lost their wife, left them after 30 years of marriage, or their business went belly up, and then anybody would have had this normal experience of depression that, and it's now being labeled as some sort of disease. And even more to the point, sometimes these people who are going through a kind of normal grief or normal sadness are told that, well, we just unmasked your depression, just like diabetes, and you have this disease that you're going to have to take medication for life on. And so that's this general category I would label as disease mongering. And I think many critics of pharmaceutical companies and psychiatry, of which I am one, but many others, I think they consider this the sole reason, the only reason for these huge increasing rates of depression in the U.S. I think it's one reason, but I think there are a lot of other things going on in this society that are increasing our level of despair and decreasing our level of resiliency. And so let me just go through a few of those. One we could actually quantify, which is this decimation of community in the United States. So remember from before, we know rates of depression are going through the roof. We know depression is highly associated with a lack of community, lack of social support. We also know something else quantitatively from people like Robert Putnam, some of you might know that sociologist, Bowling Alone, and lots of other sociologists have actually quantified over the last 50 years, last 5 decades, people have fewer friends. They spend less time with the friends they do have. Same thing with coworkers, neighbors, family members, every kind of relationship. It's just an utter decimation of social connectedness, what Putnam calls social capital. Another way of looking at this whole issue of social decimation and lack of support and depression is cross-culturally. And a lot of people a lot of readers, a lot of reviewers, they like that about, they talk a lot about, they like the cross-cultural references. So let me just give you one in relationship to postpartum depression, which is obviously the depression some women experience after childbirth. We know in the U.S. the rate of postpartum depression, depending on which studies you're looking at, somewhere between 10% to 20%, all right? A few years back, the British Medical Journal took a look at this topic of postpartum depression. They went around the world and they did this review article looking at other cultures, seeing what their levels of postpartum depression were. And what they discovered was that in cultures like Fiji or other certain African cultures where there was a structured social support after childbirth for new moms, there was no postpartum depression. It just virtually disappears. Which again, fits with this model of what I'm talking about. In the U.S., I mean, some women left alone after childbirth, I mean, if the kid was they get lucky and the kid's relatively easy to deal with, maybe nothing happens. But for a lot of other moms, there's a lot of physical demands, a lot of times emotionally feeling inadequate, and no support. And so you're increasing levels of pain. And the really kind of sad thing about the U.S. is that now we're talking more and more about postpartum depression. But how are we talking about it? We're talking about it in terms of treatment. We're talking about, I know this sounds Orwellian, but this is actual true stuff going on. We're talking about we should be screening mothers who are expectant moms. And if they look like they might become depressed, we should be putting them on antidepressants while they're still pregnant. I mean, no thinking about the fact that you're going to have not crack babies, but Prozac babies going through withdrawal as they hit the air. That's what's going to be going on. Whereas the really sad thing is if you had some humility and realized that other cultures were doing something a little bit smarter than you were, you would try to transform the society and culture so that, you'd have women with more social support, Okay? At the very least, you'd be doing some things that, like some Northern European cultures do, which most of these places you have paid paternity leave, things like that. What else? What are some of the other things going on in our society? Another huge antidote to depression, I think, from my experience, from working with people for over 2 decades, is the experience of some sort of autonomy, some control, some feeling of meaningfulness. And if you take a look at what people do in their work life in the U.S., you see this dramatic sense of meaninglessness. For example, there were studies a few years back that took a look, asked workers, what you do for a living, do you find it meaningful? And 80% of people in America said, what I'm doing for a living is utterly meaningless. It's just a paycheck. Why is that? Well, you take a look at U.S. Department of Labor leading growth jobs. What are they? Cashiers, janitors, maids, prison guards, these kind of things. And healthcare is up there. But take a look at what's going on in healthcare. I'm in healthcare. Many people are just sort of strangled by a kind of institutionalization, bureaucratization, managed care. People spend their days, many people in healthcare all day long, kind of schmoozing the managed care police just to get their patients, unless they're dealing with people who are, very wealthy. Most people have to deal with that kind of stuff. Maybe, and so that's one area, but teachers is another area. Again, teachers burning out left and right. Why is that? Many places around this country, they're obsessed with having to worry about these proficiency exams. And so there's their loss of meaning and loss of autonomy on those jobs. So you can go on and on. But overall, I see that. It's a little bit more difficult to quantify this area, but I think worth talking about. Finally, another area that I just want to talk a little bit about before I get to solutions, which is an area that I didn't think I would write as much about as I did, but when I started writing this book, it just came up in so many different ways, which was this kind of extreme consumerist society. I don't mean just a materialistic culture. I mean almost a fundamentalistic consumerist society. And how is that associated with depression? Let me give you a few different ways, I think. One way is that these advertisers, these marketers, a big way that they get to sell people things that they don't really need is to get people to sort of feel bad about feeling bad. Once you can get people to feel that their normal human reactions of just sadness, anxiety, frustration are not just sort of normal feelings, but something you better do something about in a hurry, you better buy something, well, people are more likely to go out and not just buy a psychiatric drug, but to buy a luxury car or whatever. And so it's real important for them to basically kind of alienate you from your basic humanity. And so, what happens there? Well, instead of having just normal pain of sadness, now you start to feel shame or feel bad about feeling bad, which again, that's the fuel of depression. What else? In a consumer society, people are again socialized left and right to have rising expectations all the time materially. So if you see lots of studies where we have immigrants coming over to America, for example, one study done by Vega a decade ago, he took a look at, a guy named William Vega, he took a look at Mexican immigrants coming over to the U.S., and he found within 13 years, compared to a comparable control group, their rates of depressive episodes were triple. The immigrants, the ones who came over to America, even though they had a lot more stuff. Well, why is that? Well, some of that was just a lack of community. They lost their social support. Some of it had to do with these rising expectations all of a sudden, being around all this wealth. And for many of these folks, now all of a sudden, they had the pain of not satisfying those expectations. And some of these folks, it resulted in anger, substance abuse. For other folks, it resulted in depression. What else? I mean, what happens in a consumer culture is that for a lot of people, it compels people to become increasingly self-absorbed. And that's how you get people, the more you can get people to take themselves seriously, their needs seriously, their feelings seriously, the more they're going to be buying stuff. And most people outside of modern psychiatry who have looked at despair over thousands of years, have come to the conclusion, and we're talking about Buddha, Spinoza, Erich Fromm, I mean just a long list of people, have came to the same conclusion that I have, is that self-absorption is highly associated with depression. When I get depressed, and I've been depressed in my life, I become very self-absorbed. Okay? The more self-absorbed I am, the more likely I am to be depressed. So those things really go together, and our culture encourages that. And another way, you know, and then I want to move on off of this topic of in a second here of consumerism and depression, but another way I think it encourages depression is that it reduces our level of self-reliance. So that in a consumer culture, what you're taught to value is pretty much totally money and stuff. And more people don't feel like they can do anything. There's more and more people feel like not only can't they, you know, get their own food or build their own, you know, living quarters, but they can't even. There's people out there who they can't cook. They certainly can't garden. And so what happens is you have this increasing kind of anxiety that if for some reason you lost your money, which is easy to happen, you could lose your job, you could lose your whole industry in a heartbeat in this kind of culture, or the dollar could just shrink. You know, it's even shrinking as we speak here. And so when you have that kind of dependency totally on money, people's level of anxiety is going to increase. Okay? And what's anxiety? Fear, and it's another source of pain. And so we have increasing sources of pain and decreasing kind of resiliency that goes along with a lot of things that are happening in our culture. But we can talk about some more of these areas later if you're interested. I am going to take some comments and questions after I'm done. Okay, is the area that I care probably most about, which is what the heck we can do about all of this. You know, what we can do about it on an individual basis, what we can do about it with each other, you know, what we can do to help ourselves. What can we do? And what I want to do in this regard is go through a list of areas that I think historically mental health professionals have been remiss. They have failed, or they've come up short. And they're huge areas that I think are important in solutions and antidotes to depression. The first area we've already talked about a little bit, which is just understanding what the heck depression is and its connection with society and culture. All right? The second area I think is highly important is what I call, I have a whole chapter about this in the book. It's called The Craft of Rebuilding Morale. And I think this is, you know, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail when I'm done with this list on this craft. What exactly do I mean by it? I'm trying to make it a little bit more concrete for you. But a couple of points about morale building now. One of the things that I've noticed in, again, you know, a few decades being a mental health professional, not just in my training, getting my BA, master's, PhD, and hanging around social workers, psychiatrists, psychologists a lot of my life, is that, and talking to all these folks, I've asked, you know, has any one of you ever was selected into your training program because of your talent in being a morale builder? And the answer is always no. I mean, they were selected because of test scores and GPA and GREs, and for the most part, that's how you get in. And in many ways, the way people, mental health professionals, are selected, psychiatrists into their residency, psychologists into their clinical psychology graduate training programs, the way they're selected is exactly the talents that are required to get in many ways are opposite of those talents required to be really those great morale builders. That is huge importance when you're talking about dealing with people who are depressed. And so what happens? Okay, the average person who's depressed walks into a mental health professional's office. If they walk into a physician's office nowadays, psychiatrist or some other kind of physician, with, you know, rare exceptions, and I don't mean to trash all mental health professionals, but what I am doing is sharply criticizing mental health professional training in general and saying that there are some good mental health professionals, but mostly they've rebelled against their training and their socialization. And with the exception of those folks who have sort of rebelled, your average physician who sees that depressed person walk into their office, they're going to go and spend maybe 10 or 15 minutes with them, go through these depression checklists, and they're going to walk out with a prescription for some antidepressant. In fact, I've had a patient came in right before I took this trip, and they told me they walked into that office and that psychiatrist had their prescription pad on their lap. They were just waiting. And so that's what's going to happen if you're going to see a physician, most likely. If, though, that person walks into a mental health professional who's not a physician, not a drug prescriber, a social worker, a counselor, a psychologist, what's going to most likely happen nowadays, again, with some exceptions, but what most likely happen because of the pressures of managed care and other things is that that person's going to probably get some kind of homework assignment in cognitive behavioral therapy homework assignment. What the heck does that mean? I mean, you know, if you're not a psychology major, cognitive behavioral therapy, to kind of like sum it up as briefly as I can, has a lot to do with trying to get people to think more optimistically, to less catastrophize and black and white their thinking. Also get people out and behaving in more constructive ways, so exercising more, getting out in nature. Now, all of those things are great things. I have studies in Surviving America's Depression Epidemic that show if you could get people to do that stuff, get them out in nature, get them exercising, their relapse rates are so much superior. They have like 5 times less relapse rates than people comparably who are using antidepressants. So it's a great thing, these things. But the problem for me has always been obvious, is that if you're depressed, if I'm depressed, and somebody says, well, you need to go out there and exercise, and you know where this is going, you can't do it. And for somebody like me, if somebody told me to do that, well, this is all you need to do. You need to go out and have more contact with people and have more optimistic thought, all these kinds of things. I would be annoyed. I think most people, from my experience, I see most of the people that I've seen over the years are people who have been in previous treatments, and they've either been non-productive or in many cases counterproductive. And most people I've seen, they seem like nicer than me. That they don't tell me that they were annoyed. They more like they felt like they were failures. They couldn't do what they were supposed to do. And they knew this stuff would be good for them, and they couldn't do it, and they fail. And then ask yourself, what is failure, though? Failure is pain, right? Failure, like fear, like self-loathing, anxiety, all these things are pain. And so the unintended consequences of, it's easy to go and just trash all these, drug-pushing, psychiatrists, but the unintended consequences of a lot of other non-prescriber mental health professionals who are just doling out these kind of sort of medical model cognitive behavioral therapy treatments without understanding these people can't do anything and that they need some morale. And without making that kind of distinction is in many ways are helping get some of these people even worse. And I see it all the time. A third area, that I think is vitally important that mental health professionals are also have not been great at. And in fact, they've been, I would say, uncomfortable with. And it's hugely important area is what I call the area of healing. Now, that's a pretty abstract word, so let me try to explain what I mean by that. Now, because a lot of people in this culture here, they use healing, to mean like giving a chill pill to somebody to take the edge off of their pain. I mean, for me, that's sort of closer to bartending, except I think I insult bartenders by saying that because bartenders actually talk to people some, right? In our culture. So, sorry, my apologies to any bartenders. I mean, they're probably doing more healing than your average drug prescriber out there. But anyways, let me tell you what I mean by healing, all right? When I think about healing, it's that those actions, those things that what you do that help you become more whole, or help somebody else become more whole, that help them accept more of their humanity. Specifically, let me explain. I think for most human beings out there, maybe there's some exceptions to this. Maybe somebody will jump up and tell me, I don't know what you're talking about, Dr. Levine, but for most human beings that I've ever met, if they look back at their lives, they can see that they had some demons. Now, that is a politically incorrect word to use among mental health professionals, but I love that word because it's an umbrella word that describes, for me, a lot of these powerful, kind of painful forces that compel us to do things that are problematic, whether it's depression or substance abuse or some other compulsive or obsessive kind of behavior. What are some of these demons? Well, certainly a demon for some people is some deep emotional wound caused by abuse or trauma. That's certainly a demon for a lot of people. Other demons are just, some ego attachment to something, some kind of deep resentment, some kind of a alienation from their family, from their culture, from nature. So any kind of a strong pain, that makes somebody feel less whole, less connected with themselves or others. And what's healing? What is healing? Well, healing is that action by which people feel more whole, feel more connected. And healing is very, very subjective. Again, I have a whole chapter on healing, and I should tell you that, there's a lot of different paths to it. There's not one for everyone. It really changes depending on your temperament. For some people, they move into parenting, self-healing. Some people have group healing. Other people heal by art, heal by self-expression. There's a lot of things, and I go through a lot of different kinds of healing. It really varies depending on your temperament. But what a lot of these things all have in common is that the variables involved in healing are very subjective, very non-objective, non-scientific in a way. And, one of the things I think that I should say is there's a lot of science in that book, in Surviving America's Depression Epidemic. But for people who really like science, I love science, you understand there are limitations to science. Mainly which that there are certain things in life that are hugely important that are not objective, that are not, they don't have the kind of thing, they lack the kind of attributes that make them easy to study scientifically. So for example, they're not quantifiable, they're not measurable, they're not verifiable. And so a lot of scientists, they either try to study these things and make fools of themselves, or they just forget about studying them completely and just avoid talking about them. And when you think about the variables involved in healing, that's exactly what happens. Think about healing. Lots of healing involves things like self-acceptance, compassion, forgiveness, love. I mean, how the heck do you quantify those things? You can't even define really concretely some of these things, but they're hugely powerful if you've ever experienced healing. If some event in your life, you've been able to look back in your life and you've been able to let go of some kind of insecurity or some anxiety or some resentment. And so part of what happens to a lot of depressed people out there is that when they go see a mental health professional, there's a good chance that the two of the most important traits needed for somebody you want to see when you're really depressed, being a morale builder and somebody who helps you, heal, let go of these demons, let go of these pains, that chances of finding them among mental health professionals, from my experience, is far less likely than almost the whole general population. At least that's my experience. The healers and the morale builders that I've ever found were very rarely among fellow mental health professionals. They were outside of that. And the only ones who were again, people who sort of were rebels and resistors. And a lot of the best healers I knew when I was going to graduate school, or folks I knew who were psychiatry residents, they quit because they just did not fit in. They felt incredibly alienated from this kind of mechanical, non-healing model that they were being socialized and trained in. A couple of more areas that I think the mental health profession has been remiss in. One is the area of just making a distinction between self-acceptance and self-absorption. All right? So nowadays, increasingly, I see people who've just been drugged. All right? And all they've done is focus on their symptoms and just focus on those kinds of things. And that's been a problem. But even before that, even when I saw more and more people who came in from typical psychotherapies, again, not all of them, but a lot of what would happen would be that they would be in these therapies where they just would talk about themselves. I guess it was an easy hour for the shrink. It's certainly an easy hour for me if I'm tired, just let somebody ramble on, about themselves, and then you just cha-ching, at the end of the hour. But you're not doing anybody any good. In many ways, you're making people worse. Because what happens is many of these people, and I've talked to a lot of them, have never been told the point of talking about yourself is to gain some greater self-acceptance, not so that an end in itself. The point of really healthy self-acceptance is that you move beyond self. You move to connecting with life beyond self, to connect with other people, to connect with nature. And these are your enduring antidotes to depression. And they were just not ever told that. Other things that I'll see sort of even more often than that, and sort of connected with this, is that many people are not told that once you have some degree of morale, and once you have some healing and you have some degree of self-acceptance, then you start looking at your pain very differently. You start to not be terrified of pain, but you start to stop caring about a little bit less about your own private pains, and you start to care more about the difficulties and problems of life around you, about things that other people also care about. And you start to think about those things not only because of altruistic motives, because you want to create a less depressing world, that you want to create a society maybe where there aren't trumped up wars, going on every 10, 20 years, where there aren't, where there aren't all kinds of horrific abuses in mental health care. You want to do something, you start to care about things even on a less grand political level. You start to care about like all the things that all your neighbors care about on your street, that nobody's fixing the potholes. And what you start to realize is those pains, not only are they just, they don't necessarily have to be fuel for depression, they're energy. They're fuels that can help you ultimately connect with other people who care about that same stuff. And so, one of the things, for example, I've been to a lot of, some people call them psychiatric survivor organizations, people who've been abused by, mental health professionals and forced electroshock, forced drug treatment, and a lot of folks I've known who've had some real tough stretches in their life. And they've had an enormous pain about that. But these people were wise enough and smart enough to take that pain, instead of just, being bitter and resentful and miserable and isolated for their life, to realize, there must be other people like me. And they took that pain and used it to connect with other people and to attempt to sort of solve problems and transform society. And a lot of young people I talk to, when I go through this idea of like using your difficulties, using your pain as an idea, as a way of connecting with others, they say, wait a minute, you don't get it, Bruce. You don't understand global warming, all these things. It's gone too far. Your generation, which maybe they're right about this, I don't know, baby boomers and greatest generation, you guys screwed things up so badly that there's no point in trying to change anything. It's gone too far. And you can argue with them. You could get in debates with people like that and say, well, if you took a look at the 1850s in America, no one would ever think slavery was going away. And you could go through all that. But for me, more to the point, psychologically, is to say, well, maybe you're right. Maybe we all have screwed the whole thing up so badly that there is no turning back. It is all a mess. It sort of appeals to a lot of really depressed people, I know, that idea that for some reason. But I say, but even if that's true, forget about altruism for your own well-being, for your own genuine mental health. It still makes sense to sort of act on what you care about, because you'll meet some cool people, and your life, at least how many years we all got left on this planet here, will be a little bit better. And so part of what, and again, this is very hard to do once you've got no morale, and you've got no healing, and you've got no self-acceptance. So this is like the last chapter of the book. But ultimately, the goal is to start viewing, your pain and your difficulties and problems very differently, and certainly not just immediately handing them over to authorities. Because not only in the case of political authorities or shrink authorities are they likely not to do anything useful, maybe do counterproductive things, but what you've done also is hand over to them a kind of energy that you could be using to connect with other people, okay? And so it's always important to kind of start and stop, you're being socialized, everybody's being socialized to view all their problems and difficulties as something so horrific that they must immediately kind of like get the edge taken off of that, as opposed to thinking like, well, this could be a potential, for connecting with other people. And this is not just abstract. There's lots of people, I'm sure people, when I take comments and questions, people have lots of examples for what I'm talking about. They usually are. Okay, let me pause here. I get rolling here, and I start talking a little fast, don't I? What I want to do, I want to take everybody's comments and questions, but I promised that I would get into making a little bit more concrete this whole idea of what I mean by morale building and what I mean by this craft. And that's what I want to spend the rest of the time that I'm talking here before I hear what everybody has to say. And say that this area of morale building is just been really interesting for me for I don't know, more than 30 years. It's like, what do you do to be able, how do people help themselves and help each other to be able to do these obvious antidotes that we know will work? How do we get energized? And I think over the years I've learned a lot more from people. I've learned very little from my fellow colleagues, from my mental health professionals, and I've learned a lot more through other ways. I've learned through my own sort of experimenting with clients and patients when everything else that I've been taught doesn't work. I've learned through reading books, memoirs by famous depressed people. I've learned through my own experiences of being depressed. But a lot of it, again, this is an area that I would say is not real scientific, but worth talking about. All right? So I just want to kind of throw out some things just to get people thinking. And first place I want to start is in the beginning of my clinical practice. And just, I should tell you that I work with adults and young people, teenagers And the good thing about working with young people, along with adults, is that when you're working with young people and what you're doing is not working, you get immediate feedback. I mean, you get these blank stares and one-word responses, and you just kind of know that you're torturing them, and so they torture you. And that could go either way. For a lot of shrinks, they start to hate these people because they're making them feel like incompetent and worthless, and so they take their anger out on them by controlling them, and that's a whole other deal. But for me, it was just like, okay, well, you're giving me immediate feedback that what I'm doing isn't working, so it's time to start thinking about other things. And the more, what else can you do? And so one particular story I have in the book about this one young guy early in my days of private practice who was very depressed, and a lot of different reasons, a lot of pains in his life, family pains, parental pains, absent father, a lot of things like that. But the pain that he was had most access to, the most consciousness of, was this horrible, miserable principal who had it in for this kid, who was handing out draconian punishment one after another to him. Of course, this kid, it made him more angry and disrespectful to the principal, and you had this kind of whole vicious cycle of the principal felt his disrespect, and on it went, to the point where one week this kid comes in and that depression's now moved into what shrinks might call agitated depression, which is just saying that not only do you have all those other depression symptoms, but you start to kind of lash out with your pain. You start like maybe moving into a little vandalism, or definitely you're going to quit school, and you're going to do you're just kind of like, you're just in this kind of self-destructive and destructive both kind of a mode. And that's where this young guy was. And, I had in the earlier sessions, it was very early in my practice, done all the things that I was taught to do, all these rational emotive therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy and anger management, and I even family therapy, and certainly there was their Rogerian empathy and listening and understanding what he was feeling, all those kinds of things. And I could look at it, was just, it was worthless. It wasn't doing anything. This kid was going down. And, I don't think the kid was going to, he was certainly going to ruin a significant part of his life. And I figured, I just felt like, well, I got to do something here. Different. And so one week he comes in, and he's going through one more series of these kind of draconian punishments. This principal's just making it even worse and worse for him. And I just looked at him, and I had this kind of feeling. I just hated feeling useless. I said, maybe my colleagues have a higher toleration for feeling useless and worthless than I do. But it's just a lousy feeling. And so I said, well, what the hell do I got to lose? Let me try something else. And I just looked at him, and I just started to be like completely authentic. And I said, the heck with this stupid psychotherapy stuff. And and it got his attention, which already got my energy level up. It's like, it's nice to talk to somebody who's actually listening to you. So all of a sudden I get a little more energy. And I looked at him and I said, I'm going to go to that school, and I'm going to tell this asshole off. Who does he think he is? Going on some power trip, with some kid who can't do anything about it, And I'm just like revved up into this thing here. Well, he's a tough kid, and most of the guys that I ever see, young men who ever come to my office, it's just like there's no way you're going to go in there and talk to my principal. And he said, you can't do that, Bruce. And I said to him, I pushed this. I was on a roll. And I said, look, you don't understand. I've been doing this a little bit for you, but I'm doing this some for myself. And I pointed to all the diplomas on the wall on BAs and MAs and PhDs. And I said, I'm starting to feel all that stuff is a total waste of time. I got nothing, that could actually help you here. Except I got one thing. That means nothing for like cool people like you and your friends, but it's going to mean a lot for that principal, which is the stupid PhD. Most cool people don't care about those degrees, but your principal, he'll care. In this crazy society, I outrank him. And he started to laugh, and he was just cracking up, I obviously from his point of view, his shrink had gone over the top, he was over the edge, and he was just chuckling. And I'm just sitting there, and I'm rolling, I'm thinking like, I'm going to do this thing, I'm going to convince this kid, I'm going in there. I was really serious. And out of nowhere, he just says, Bruce, I've got another plan. And I said, what do you mean? He said, I'm going to transfer from this school into another school in my district. And I just looked at him, I said, why didn't you tell me you can do that before? And I said, I don't know. And so what happened, though, I should tell you, is like years later, I stayed in contact with this guy. okay? He's in his 30s now, and by the way, he did transfer. He usually successful life. He, has business. He has his own business, making tons of money. He actually built his own log house from scratch. He's usually a successful guy. And while I was writing this book, I talked to him about this incident. And I asked him, I said, what the heck do you think? You remember that incident? First of all, I asked him, and he said, oh yeah, I remember that real well. And he says, what do you think was helpful in all that, if anything? And he said, well, I don't know. That was his first thing. But let me think about it. He said, one of the things I think was just the fact that you had all of this passion for the whole thing. It sort of like felt good that you kind of had that energy. And then he said, something else I think maybe was that you were so, and he didn't use the word foaming at the mouth, but that was kind of sort of what he said. He said, you were so like that, it kind of distracted me from my own kind of misery and my own, whatever, and it just kind of liberated me. It freed me up to kind of like use my brain a little bit. And I kind of guessed that's what he would say, because since then I've had other kinds of experiences like that. And one of the interesting things for me is that when I started to kind of reach out elsewhere, outside of my training, to my own personal experiences, to all these other sources about morale building, it was really funny for me that would be no surprise what I did to you, even your average coach or manager of a sports team. They know when their team is down in the dumps, they don't give them cognitive behavioral therapy feedback. They don't go and give them. They know you do something crazy. You go and pick a spot in the game where you get kicked out by an umpire or referee, and make a fool out of yourself if you even have to, and get fined even. And autobiographies and memoirs of famous depressed people, you see almost all of them use humor to kind of help them out of their states of depression. And probably one of the most famous people in that regard in American history is Abraham Lincoln, who is a major depressive. In fact, a guy a little while ago wrote a book specifically about Lincoln's depression. Some of you might have seen a book called Lincoln's Melancholy. And his whole point is sort of on the defense of a lot of the book, proving that by today's standards, Lincoln, even though he didn't have Prozac or electroshock treatment, somehow without all that, he was able to do okay. And he was afraid that the psychiatric establishment would say, well, he wasn't really a depressive. So he went out of his way to prove, Lincoln actually had 2 points in his life where he was so suicidal, his friends formed a suicide watch. Sounds like a major depressive to me. His law partner of over 11 years said about Lincoln, this is the most gloomy guy I've ever known. And there's just lots of other things that click off every symptom for depression that Lincoln had that would be considered a depressive today. So what did Lincoln do? Well, a lot of what he did was use of humor. If you take a look at every Lincoln biography you're ever going to read, a lot of them talk about how he used humor politically to kind of socially connect with folks. But a lot of them don't talk about the fact that Lincoln also used it as one of his major antidotes to his own personal depression. And in fact, there's a Lincoln quote that says, if not for these stories, jokes, and jests, I would die. That's how important they were for him. And so, humor is this really big deal. And one of the things that makes me very sad is that a lot of depressed people I've run into over the years also have great senses of humor. But they don't know about it. And they don't know about it for a couple of reasons. They don't know about it because, they're so isolated out there, they don't get the feedback, or all they've ever been doing is going to see mental health professionals who don't laugh when they say things that I think are hilarious. And I know because they come in and tell me things. And I go, stuff, and they don't get that kind of feedback. This is not a client. This is not a patient. This is a guy I knew in New York. And I should tell you, if you're trying to figure out this accent of mine, it comes from first couple of decades of my life in Queens, New York, and the last 30 years in Cincinnati, Ohio. And so I'd go back to New York every once or twice a year, routinely. And on one of my visits, I go back to see this guy who's tells me, I've known him for a long time, and he says he's been depressed and he's been to all this psychotherapy and it hasn't worked. And he's going to go, and he tells a story about how he finally decided he's going to go get his antidepressant medication. And he tells me then that after he makes the appointment in a week to go see the doctor, he gets asked out for a date. And I said, wait a minute, stop. I said, you were so depressed you were wanting to get some medication, but some woman asked you out for a date? And he looked at me and he says, you don't understand, Bruce. This is New York. These women are really pushy and they're hot up. You know? He said, you've been away too long from the city. This is what's happened here. And I'm going, I think you're being a little modest here. He said, no. This is the case. And so he said, so he goes on and tells me the story that he, before, the antidepressants really weren't working that well. And the day of the date, he still felt depressed. And he didn't, he went through his head, well, I don't know if I'm not attracted to this woman, or, maybe it's just my depression, but, these are antidepressants, and maybe I'll take an extra one. Maybe that'll work. His doctor hadn't told him anything, and this is routinely happens, I haven't told him anything about side effects or anything like that. So he takes an extra antidepressant, and he just falls asleep, which is a common kind of thing that happens when people are taking even their regular dosage. They get real groggy with these antidepressants. And so he falls asleep, he sleeps through the day. Well, as he's sleeping through the day, he hears this loud knocking on the door. And he opens up the door, and it's that woman. And she says, where were you? Where were you? And he says to her, well, let me tell you what happened. And he just proceeds to, a lot of depressed folks I know are like honest, almost compulsively honest to a fault. And he says to her, well, I woke up this morning and I was really depressed and I wasn't sure, maybe I was not attracted to you. I said, you told her all that stuff? You told her all that? I said, wasn't she hurt? Or wasn't she angry? He said, Bruce, you've been away from New York far too long. He said, she just pushed me to go out with her later in the week. And so I had the same kind of reaction that a lot of you are having. And he's just looking at me. He says, why are you laughing? And he sort of like Joe Pesci a little bit. Actually, he did talk a little bit like Joe Pesci. And he says, do I amuse you? It's almost like that kind of thing. And I said, it's funny, man, And he said, I told this to my psychiatrist, I told this to my doctor. I told him, I was like, he didn't laugh. I said, well, what did he do? He got angry with me for, when I told him I took the extra antidepressant. He got very angry with me. He said, you didn't laugh at all at any of this story? I said, no, you're the first person who's laughed. And then I said, well, it's funny, man. I said it's friggin' funny, but I didn't say friggin'. And he started to laugh. And he said, it is pretty funny. And he started to feel better. And he started to kind of move out of himself. And he started to realize what a lot of people understand. A lot of people who call, whether they're psychiatric survivors or whomever, people can use even their most horrendous, awful hospitalizations or horrible depressive events, that when they stop taking themselves so seriously, these things become funny and connecting. And learn what Lincoln learned. Okay, one last vignette, and then we'll go on to hear you guys. But I just want to finish up with one more kind of story, which is about me. Because I should tell you, I've gone through periods of being depressed. Probably the most severe periods is when I was hanging around with mental health professionals in my graduate training, because that was pretty painful. But I've had some other stretches. And one stretch was several years back in the first writing project that I ever really cared about, which was before this Surviving America's Depression Epidemic, before Common Sense Rebellion, which were these nonfiction books which are not easy to get published by a publisher, but I'm a PhD psychologist, and these were nonfiction about things that they would think I'd have some credibility in, so it wasn't impossible. But my first project, in my infinite innocence or naivete or maybe stupidity, I wanted to write a coming-of-age novel. It was a political coming-of-age novel, and people weren't interested. And I got actually lots of good endorsements from some pretty famous people, but I had this file of rejection letters from agents and editors, and what's rejection but pain, right? Again, so you just start to, at some point, you just shut down, you just stop giving a damn, and you start to, when people start giving you advice, what to do next, you start getting annoyed with them, and you certainly don't do it, and you just start giving up, and that's one of the things that I certainly moved into. And I'm in this kind of state with this project, and I'm sitting at home one day, and I get this telephone call. And I pick it up, and it's this elderly woman. And she starts to talk, and I can't figure out who she is, what this is all about. I don't get it. And then after about 2 minutes or so, I figured it out. She was a telemarketer. And I had no energy to assert myself and hang up on her. And so I said, oh no. So I just let her go on. I said, well, maybe somewhere something will happen. And so I just let her go on. And somewhere in there, again, I should say, a lot of discoveries that people are open out there, just pure serendipity, pure experimentation. If you just give yourself permission to say sometimes being depressed will be an opportunity for something, if you just hang in there. Okay? And out of nowhere, she asked me a question I never had a telemarketer asked me. She says, what do you do for a living? And what happens to me when I'm depressed, I get depressed enough so I can't get out of bed. I get physically immobilized, but my brain still works a little bit, enough to be maybe a little bit mischievous. You know, and especially with a telemarketer. And so as soon as she said that, what do you do for a living? It just came over me. I said to her, I'm a telemarketer evangelist. Well, she had no idea what the hell I was talking about, and so she just stopped. And I said, let me tell you what I mean. I'm not one of those televangelists. I'm not one of those guys who do this stuff, you know, evangelize on television. I minister to people exactly like you. And she just said nothing. She was just silent. And I said, because I've come to the conclusion, who could be in more pain than people like you? You're taking on the rage and the anger and the frustration of a whole helpless, you know, hopeless world out there. And when you call them, you're the person they get to dump it all over. And she said, yes, yes, yes. She was just totally energized. So I just went on. Now I got energized because, you know, we were having a more human conversation here as opposed to this robotic telemarketer conversation. So as she got energized, I said, you know, I can tell you're a good person here. I can feel it, and I can tell you're not going to be doing this for your entire life. I feel that's a pretty safe prediction, right? And then I said, and I'm sure you're going to find a job that's more meaningful, okay? That even is going to pay more, all right? And I figured that was pretty safe kind of prediction as well. And she just said thank you. And then she paused and she went, God bless you. And she kept on going. She said, God bless you. No, I really mean that. God bless you. And I hung up the phone and I was just smiling. I felt better. And I actually talked to a friend or two and I told them the whole story. And they were laughing and I got some energy. And, you know, what happened over the next couple months is actually, and I continue to get these telemarketers. Some of these people were, you know, would stay robotic. At least I had now enough energy to just hang up on them. But some of these people would stay, you know, get human. And this would be this kind of energizing thing that would make me chuckle. And with this kind of, I call this like good-natured mischief or whatever you want to call it, but a lot of other things I talk about in the book over the next few months, somehow I got up enough energy with a few friends of mine to actually self-publish that first project, that novel. And I should tell you, if I ever give a talk on how to kind of move up the chain to, you know, to actually get real publishers to write your books, that actually sort of helped that whole self-publishing thing. And the end of that story, let me just, you know, the end of that story is, what happens is, after I get that book self-published, I'm sitting around the dining room table with a few friends of mine. One of these friends is clergy, I should say. And I get a telephone call, and it's a telemarketer. And I did what I always did with these telemarketers in my period of ministering to them. I said, look, you know, I'm not going to buy anything from you, so you may not want to be spending too much time with you. And, you know, I know your supervisor may be monitoring a call. And this guy, I'll never forget this. This guy's a young man from Kansas. As soon as I said that, he said, I don't give a damn about my stupid supervisor. I see him through that glass window. He is monitoring this call right now, and I don't give a damn. He can fire me. So how could you not like a guy like that, right? So I just started busting out. I did exactly what you guys did. I started laughing. And when I was looking like I was having so much fun, my friend, who's the clergy, he said, let me talk to this guy. I said, what the heck do you know, what do you want? Should we do this all day long? But, you know, now he didn't have to do it, so it was more fun. You know, that's the kind of thing with a lot of clergy. It's more fun when they don't have to, when their congregants aren't demanding. So he gets on the phone, and I went back to talk to my other friends, and all of a sudden, I'm hearing him. He's talking about this book that I self-published to this telemarketer. And he says, Bruce, I have something to show you. He says, Bruce, he says, the guy wants to buy your book. What do we want to sell it for? I said, what, are you kidding? I mean, and he says, no, he wants to buy it. I said, okay. So we pick a price, and I just forget about it, and 5 days later, I get a check in the mail from the telemarketer for this book. We send him the book. And so when I was writing this writing this book, I said, I was looking for kind of fun stories to kind of give a feel of this craft of morale building, self-morale building, helping others with morale. And I thought, like, wow, here, listen, I thought about this. Look, I'd been almost immobilized here. I had moved into this, whatever you want to call it, good-natured mischief, brought a little fun to a few of these people's lives, lifted up my spirits. Never bought anything from any of these telemarketers. They bought one thing from me. I actually made one sell to them. And I said, like, the nature or the gods was telling me that I should put this in the book. So I did. I put that. There's a couple of paragraphs in the book on that one. I should tell you here, okay, is that, when you take a look at this whole kind of craft of morale building, and you start thinking about being depressed very differently. You stop being like terrified of it and stop medicalizing and pathologizing and diseasing it and seeing it as a normal human reaction that sometimes gets out of hand and could potentially be catastrophic, but it still be a normal human reaction to pain. You start to kind of, your brain opens up and you start thinking this is kind of a vehicle that not just artists have, when they look back at many of their lives, they say like, wow, these periods of depression were the vehicles for that book or that poem or that song. You read about that all the time when you're studying this stuff, but that you start to kind of view, you start to think about what you have more consciousness, whether when you're depressed or not depressed, that what's sort of energizing. And one of the things that occurred to me when I was writing this book that I never really thought about, why I like certain great quotations so much, why I put them in all my books. Why do I love Mark Twain quotes or George Orwell quotes or Thoreau quotes? Why do I love them? And I started to kind of think, a lot of these quotes that I really like, they take some real painful thing and somehow through kind of wisdom and poetry, they're able to kind of transform that pain into energy. And I give you a couple examples. One of the lines that I actually have it in the book and that I use with young people all the time, because a lot of young people, I think really intelligent young people who hate school. They just hate school, but they're super intelligent. And so I tell them about the Mark Twain line. They've all heard about Mark Twain. They've been forced to read things from him, when they didn't want to read them. And they've heard about it. I said, did you ever hear this Mark Twain line? They said, never let schooling interfere with your education. And that always gives them some energy. Mark Twain said that? Oh, yeah, he hated school. I hated it. It's different than education. And I'll leave you with one last sort of quotation prescription. And my medicine cabinet is filled not with psychotropic drugs, not with antidepressants, but more with things like this, with things like quotations. And one of my favorite sources for quotations that give you morale are Thoreau. And I mean, you think about Thoreau's era, as he's a young man, what's the America's still has slavery. They're involved in this, one of their first great idiotic imperialist wars, stealing, California and the Southwest from Mexico. Nobody really, you got a whole Congress who's just, kind of like buying into it. Very few people, John Quincy Adams and 10 or 11 other people are voting against this. He's looking around at his neighbors just falling into line. He's repulsed. He's disgusted. But he's Thoreau. And so he says, it's not just good enough to kind of spew venom and, and just, you have to kind of do something with your pain. So what does he write? What does he say? Thoreau says, the greater part of what my neighbors call good, I believe in my soul to be bad. And if I repent of anything, it will likely be my good behavior. What demon possessed me that I behaved so well? And so lots of times I'm talking to mental health professionals who, they're in these institutions, these bureaucratic settings, or they're dealing with managed care all day long, and they're just, and they're just overwhelmed. And I said, hey, this is my favorite prescription for you, but just replace neighbor with, say, your colleagues or your mental health institutions. The greater part of what the psychopharmaceutical industrial complex calls good, I believe in my heart to be bad. And if I repent of anything, okay, it will likely be my good behavior. What demon possessed me that I behaved so well? Thank you. Thank you, everybody.